The war had a way of exposing every weakness a doctrine tried to hide. By 1942, Allied commanders had learned that lesson the hard way. Across the windswept deserts of North Africa and the dense, unforgiving jungles of the Pacific, the battlefield was a place that refused to conform to theory. Heavy tanks that had been designed for European planes bogged down in sand or vanished in the mud, their engines choking on dust or humidity. Armored cars, with their speed and firepower, were ideal for scouting and patrol, but they were too few, too expensive, and too delicate to risk in forward positions. Infantry patrols, stripped of mechanized support, were left exposed, vulnerable to ambushes, artillery fire, and the sudden appearance of fast-moving enemy vehicles. Every campaign report echoed the same frustration. There was a gap in the Allied arsenal, a space between the brute force of a tank and the bare-bones mobility of men on foot. It was in this gap that the Willys MB, the unassuming box-shaped four-wheel drive utility vehicle known simply as a Jeep, quietly thrived. It was never designed to fight. Conceived as a nimble reconnaissance and transport vehicle, the Jeep was cheap, light, and remarkably dependable. It could be built in the tens of thousands, shipped overseas by the boatload, and repaired in the field with little more than a wrench and a welding torch. It ferried officers to command posts, hauled ammunition across muddy roads, and served as ambulances, radio platforms, and general-purpose workhorses. But as the war dragged on, officers on the front lines began to see something else in the Jeep. Not just a utility vehicle, but a blank canvas. The idea was whispered first in motor pools and field workshops, usually by junior officers who had seen too many men die in the space between a tank column and a marching platoon. If a Jeep could carry 4 men and a radio, why couldn't it carry a machine gun? If it could climb rocky slopes and ford rivers, why couldn't it outflank an enemy convoy? It was light, yes, but that also meant it was fast, maneuverable, and expendable. A tank was a precious resource that required fuel, maintenance, and careful deployment. A Jeep was a tool, and tools, as one British officer put it, could be repurposed. On the North African front, where the Afrika Korps mobility often outmatched Allied infantry, commanders began to experiment. Jeeps were stripped of non-essential weight, fitted with pintle mounts for .30 caliber Brownings, and sent ahead of columns to scout and harass enemy flanks. In the Pacific, where supply lines snaked through hostile jungle, some units welded steel plating to their Jeep's sides and lined their floors with sandbags, hoping to give patrols a fighting chance against ambushes. These were improvised solutions, born of necessity and desperation, but they pointed toward a larger possibility. The humble Jeep might be more than a battlefield taxi. It might be the answer to a tactical riddle no tank could solve. At the same time, the industrial realities of war pushed commanders toward creative thinking. The production of medium and heavy tanks consumed enormous resources and took months of lead time. Armored cars were even hard to come by, their specialized components requiring dedicated factories. Jeeps, by contrast, rolled off assembly lines at an astonishing rate. Nearly 650,000 would be built by war's end, and they could be modified in the field with little more than scrap metal and ingenuity. In an era when logistics often determined victory as much as strategy, the Jeep's ubiquity was itself a weapon. But the idea of turning such a small, vulnerable vehicle into an offensive tool was more than a logistical decision. It was a philosophical shift. Modern armies had long equated firepower with armor and armor with weight. The heavier the vehicle, the more destructive it was presumed to be. The notion that speed and improvisation could serve as armor themselves seemed reckless, even absurd, to some high-ranking officers. Yet as the reports from the front accumulated, accounts of lightly armed Jeeps slipping through enemy lines, destroying supply trucks, and disappearing before a counterattack could be mounted, skepticism began to waver. In war, innovation rarely arrives as a polished doctrine. It begins as a question, often posed in the most desperate circumstances. By the winter of 1942, that question was echoing from the Libyan desert to Solomon Islands. If a tank could not be everywhere, and soldiers could not fight unprotected, could the little four-wheel workhorse that every unit relied on be transformed into something new? Could it become not just a vehicle for movement, but a weapon of mobility itself? It was a gamble that would soon redefine how armies thought about mechanized warfare. And like so many turning points in history, It started not in a laboratory or design bureau, but in the dust and heat of the battlefield, with a handful of soldiers staring at a jeep and daring to see a tank. The afternoon sun in Tunisia had a way of baking everything into silence. The sand, the steel, even the men. It was in this heavy, heat-soaked quiet that Lieutenant Colonel Robert read Maxwell crouched over an empty ration box, his pencil scratching a crude outline that would change the way armies thought about light vehicles. Around him, the motor pool at the edge of the Allied encampment was a cluttered landscape of half-disassembled jeeps, oil drums, and the scorched hulks of wrecked trucks salvaged for parts. Mechanics moved slowly in the oppressive heat, stripping engines, hammering out dents, and cursing the endless dust that coated every tool. To most of them, the jeep was what it had always been, a mule machine built to haul men and gear, nothing more. But to Maxwell, it was a weapon waiting to happen. He had spent weeks thinking about the problem. His infantry units were fast and aggressive, but too lightly armed to break through entrenched positions. The armored divisions, with their Shermans and Churchills, could smash through defenses but were too heavy and too slow to exploit fleeting opportunities. German reconnaissance patrols were slipping behind Allied lines in nimble vehicles, probing weak points and disappearing before tanks could respond. Maxwell believed there was a solution hidden in plain sight. He had watched jeeps tear across dunes, outpacing armored cars and slipping through terrain where heavier vehicles bogged down. If they could move that fast while carrying real firepower, he reasoned, they might change the tempo of the fight entirely. The idea was simple enough on paper. Strip down a jeep to its essentials, bolt on thin plates of armor to protect the crew from small arms fire, mount a .50 caliber machine gun on a roll bar, and turn it into a fast-moving raider. It would not slug out with tanks or withstand artillery, but that wasn't the point. Maxwell envisioned swarms of these vehicles operating like cavalry, hitting enemy convoys, harassing flanks, and vanishing before a counterattack could be organized. They would not replace tanks. They would make tanks more effective by shaping the battlefield ahead of them. When he shared the sketch with his mechanics, the reaction was immediate and predictable. They laughed. The idea of turning a jeep into a tank seemed absurd. The vehicle's thin frame couldn't handle armor, they said. The recoil from a heavy machine gun would tear it apart. One mechanic joked that Maxwell might as well strap wings to the thing and call it an airplane. But Maxwell was not easily discouraged. A veteran of the North African campaign and a student of history, he knew that many of war's greatest innovations, from trench mortars to paratroopers, had started as jokes in mess tents. The key was finding someone willing to take a risk. Maxwell brought his idea to Brigadier General Thomas Hargrove, the sector commander, during a briefing in late March 1943. Hargrove was a pragmatic officer, skeptical of untested concepts, but deeply aware of the tactical gap that plagued his operations. Maxwell laid out the problem plainly. Tanks were too slow, infantry too vulnerable, armored cars too few. He argued that a fleet of fast, lightly armored jeeps could operate as the eyes and claws of the army, raiders that could harass enemy lines, disrupt supply columns, and seize lightly defended positions. Hargrove listened, asked questions, and finally leaned back with a wry smile. "If you can build one that doesn't fall apart on the first bump," he said, "I'll find the fuel to run it." With that, the project was born. Maxwell commandeered a handful of battered jeeps from the motor pool and set a team of mechanics to work. They scavenged steel from wrecked half-tracks, cut armor plates from disabled tanks, and welded improvised shields around the engine block and crew compartment. A salvaged M2 Browning heavy machine gun was mounted on a reinforced roll bar, its long barrel jutting skyward like a lance. The result was ungainly and awkward, a Frankenstein's monster of field engineering. But it ran. The first test drive was a chaotic spectacle. The added weight made the jeep sluggish on turns, and the recoil from the .50 caliber shook the entire chassis. But when the vehicle roared across the sand at 40 miles an hour, spitting fire from its mounted gun, Maxwell saw the spark of something new. It was not yet a weapon, not truly, but it was proof that the impossible might be possible after all. Soldiers stopped their work to watch the strange contraption race past the motor pool, and a few even cheered as it kicked up plumes of dust. The laughter that had greeted Maxwell's sketch was gone now, replaced by a low hum of curiosity. No one knew then that this crude prototype would become the template for hundreds of field-modified vehicles across multiple fronts. No one imagined that within a year, swarms of armed jeeps would be raiding convoys, seizing crossroads, and changing the way the Allies fought. But Maxwell knew, as he watched his Mosquito tank disappear into the desert horizon, its gun chattering in the heat. He understood that war often turned on moments like this, when a wild idea scribbled on a ration box stops being a fantasy and starts becoming a force. The first conversions looked more like desperation than innovation. They were hastily built, unevenly welded, and often assembled with whatever happened to be lying around a motor pool. Mechanics scavenged broken tank skirts from scrap piles, hammered them into rough panels, and bolted them onto the sides of jeeps that had once been used for little more than ferrying officers to briefings. Sandbags, hundreds of them, were stacked across the floorboards to provide some measure of protection against landmines and small arms fire. It was a crude sort of armor, uneven and lumpy, but it was all that the men had. The mounts of machine guns were even more improvised. Heavy steel brackets were welded to the roll bars, sometimes reinforced with lengths of pipe or salvage rail track. Onto these, the crews bolted .30 caliber Browning machine guns taken from damaged half-tracks or dismounted from defensive emplacements. The finished vehicles were ungainly, top-heavy, and often difficult to steer, but they were also something new. The first field trials took place in late April 1943 along a stretch of desert road south of Gafsa. A patrol of 3 modified jeeps, each carrying a 2-man crew, set out at dawn to probe the edges of German-held territory. The plan was simple: find an enemy reconnaissance unit, engage it, and pull back before a counterattack could form. It was an experiment, and no one knew if the lightly armored jeeps would survive their first contact. Some officers doubted they'd even make it past the first burst of enemy fire. But the men who volunteered to crew them were eager to prove that their makeshift machines could do more than just survive. The jeep's first encounter came just after sunrise. A column of German SD, KFZ, 222 armor cars, light reconnaissance vehicles with 20mm autocannons, was spotted moving along a ridge road. In a traditional engagement, the German superior firepower and armor would have given them the advantage. But Maxwell's improvised raiders did not intend to fight conventionally. They fanned out across the dunes, using their speed and agility to skirt the flanks of the column. As the German gunners scrambled to bring their weapons to bear, the jeeps opened fire from unexpected angles. Streams of .30 caliber rounds peppered the thin armor of the recon cars, shattering viewports and damaging tires. Within minutes, one of the German vehicles was disabled, its crew abandoning it under fire. The others retreated, leaving the Americans in control of the ground. For all their crude construction, the modified jeeps had proven something important. They were fast, far faster than the German armor cars, and they were difficult targets to hit. Their lack of heavy armor, once seen as a fatal flaw, became an advantage when combined with mobility and surprise. They could appear suddenly on a flank, unleash a burst of fire, and disappear over a dune before heavier enemy units could respond. The jeep's crews quickly learned to exploit this agility, refining their tactics with each mission. They began operating in pairs, one vehicle firing while the other maneuvered for a better angle. They attacked convoys at night, using the desert terrain for cover and retreating before enemy artillery could be brought to bear. The psychological effect of these attacks was out of proportion to their actual firepower. German units began reporting phantom raiders harassing their supply lines, fast, small, and impossible to pin down. Convoys altered their routes, escorts were doubled, and precious fuel and manpower were diverted to counter a threat that, in material terms, barely existed. That was the brilliance of Maxwell's concept. It wasn't about brute strength, but about disruption. The jeeps didn't need to destroy tanks or capture strongholds. They only needed to force the enemy to react, to stretch their defenses thin, and to sow uncertainty. Yet, the early successes did not blind anyone to the shortcomings. The welded scrap armor rattled loose after long drives, and the added weight strained the jeep's suspensions to breaking point. The sandbags, though effective against shrapnel, made the vehicles sluggish and hard to steer. The machine guns overheated easily, and ammunition was limited. Crews often carried boxes of spare belts in their laps, reloading under fire. But each problem identified was also an opportunity for refinement. Mechanics began experimenting with lighter armor plating and better gun mounts. Some Jeeps had extra fuel tanks fitted for extended operations, while others were modified with larger tires to handle rough terrain. Despite their flaws, these early conversions were a revelation. They had taken a tool of logistics and turned it into an instrument of war. They showed that speed and initiative could compensate for a lack of armor, and that a handful of determined men in improvised vehicles could challenge the enemy's mobility on open ground. For the first time, commanders began to see the Jeep not as a support vehicle but as a weapon system in its own right. And though these rough prototypes were far from perfect, they had opened a door that no one would close again. What began as an experiment in a dusty Tunisian motor pool was now a tactical reality. It was only the beginning of what the little Jeep could become. The desert was both cruel teacher and perfect laboratory. In the vast open spaces of Tunisia and Libya, where the horizon stretched endlessly and the sun scorched the sand into glassy waves, the limits of traditional warfare were exposed for all to see. Heavy tanks struggled to maneuver in the soft dunes, bogging down or overheating, as their engines fought against a punishing environment. Artillery was devastating when it found a target, but often useless against fast-moving threats that appeared and vanished before the first shell could land. It was in this unforgiving landscape that Maxwell's gun Jeeps were truly tested, and where they revealed the one quality that would make them indispensable: speed. From the beginning, commanders treated the modified Jeeps as experimental assets. They were assigned to reconnaissance patrols, tasked with scouting enemy positions ahead of larger mechanized units. What surprised even the most skeptical officers was how quickly their role expanded. On their first deep penetration mission into German-held territory, a platoon of 4-gun Jeeps traveled over 60 miles in less than 3 hours, bypassing minefields, slipping past outposts, and emerging behind enemy lines with barely a shot fired. When they encountered a small supply convoy near El Getter, they didn't attempt a prolonged firefight. Instead, they hit fast. A coordinated strike from multiple directions that shredded 2 trucks, scattered infantry, and forced the survivors into retreat before the Germans could organize a defense. By the time Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to investigate, the Jeeps were already gone, leaving only smoking wreckage and sand. The success of these raids changed how commanders thought about the vehicles. No longer were they just reconnaissance tools. They were weapons of disruption. In engagement across the Libyan frontier, gun Jeeps proved they could exploit terrain in ways no tank or half-track could. They slipped through wadis and dry riverbeds, circled behind entrenched machine gun nests, and attacked from angles the defenders hadn't even considered. When German anti-tank units deployed to counter them, the Jeeps were gone before their guns could traverse. When artillery batteries tried to zero in, the Jeeps dispersed into the dunes, regrouped, and struck elsewhere. Their light weight and small size made them difficult to hit, and their blistering mobility made them almost impossible to corner. One operation near the Marth line in early May 1943 became legendary among the men who witnessed it. A mixed patrol of 6 Jeeps was ordered to harass Axis logistics ahead of an impending Allied offensive. They moved under cover of night, headlights covered, engines muffled with canvas. By dawn, they had intercepted a German fuel convoy, 10 trucks, lightly escorted, and launched a swift, coordinated assault. 2 Jeeps raked the lead vehicles with machine gun fire, blocking the road. The others swept down the flanks, firing at tires, fuel drums, and drivers. Within minutes, the convoy was a mess of burning trucks and scattered survivors. Before enemy reinforcement arrived, the Jeeps had melted back into the desert, covering 40 miles of empty terrain before stopping to refuel. They had destroyed more enemy equipment in a single raid than some tank platoons managed in a week. Reports from these missions filtered back to Allied command posts with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Commanders who had once dismissed the modified Jeeps as little more than curiosities now requested entire units of them. Intelligence officers noted that Axis supply routes were being rerouted, forcing the enemy into longer, less efficient paths. German field commanders complained bitterly about the insects, as they derisively called the Jeeps, that swarmed their convoys and evaporated before retaliation was possible. Even Rommel's staff acknowledged a problem in intercepted communications, describing the vehicles as irritating and elusive, a nuisance that tied down disproportionate resources. But the most significant discovery wasn't just that the Jeeps could kill, it was how they changed the tempo of battle itself. Traditional armored warfare was ponderous, deliberate, and linear. Gun Jeeps were chaotic, fast, and unpredictable. They introduced a new kind of pressure, one that forced the enemy to react constantly and spread their defenses thin. In an environment where supply lines stretched hundreds of miles and reinforcements were always too far away, that pressure could be decisive. The crews themselves began to adapt their tactics to match the environment. They learned to strike in waves, staggering their attacks so that German units could never predict where the next raid would come from. They operated at night, guided by stars and compasses, slipping deep into enemy territory and striking from unexpected directions at dawn. They even coordinated with Allied air reconnaissance, timing their assaults to coincide with low-level fighter sweeps that kept German heads down. What began as an experiment in Tunisia was quickly becoming doctrine. The gun Jeeps were proving that mobility could be a weapon every bit as powerful as armor or firepower. They weren't meant to hold ground or trade blows with tanks. They were meant to shape the battlefield, to keep the enemy off balance and force mistakes. And in the vast, unforgiving deserts of North Africa, that lesson was written clearly in the sand. Speed, more than steel, was the true armor of modern war. The success of the early gun Jeep patrols did not remain a tactical curiosity for long. Maxwell's field reports, once tucked into after-action briefings and circulated among a handful of commanders in Tunisia, soon found their way into the hands of senior Allied strategists in Cairo and London. They were blunt, data-driven documents, casualty figures, destroyed convoys, intercepted communications, but they told a story that was impossible to ignore. The crude little vehicles that mechanics had once mocked as death traps were now delivering results that conventional armored units struggled to match. They were cheaper, faster, easier to maintain, and they operated with a level of unpredictability that traditional enemy defenses were ill-equipped to counter. The implications were too significant to dismiss. It was the British Special Air Service, the SAS, who were among the first to recognize the full potential of what Maxwell's experiment had revealed. Formed in 1941 as a deep penetration commando unit designed to disrupt Axis operations far behind the front lines, the SAS had already mastered the art of unconventional warfare. Their small teams moved silently through hundreds of miles of desert, destroying aircraft on the ground, sabotaging fuel dumps, and vanishing before Axis forces could organize a response. Yet even they were constrained by the limits of their transport. The vehicles they used were often overloaded with supplies and fuel, slow across difficult terrain, and vulnerable to ambush if spotted. Maxwell's report suggests a solution, one that matched perfectly with their doctrine of speed, surprise, and violence. By mid-1943, SAS workshops in North Africa were busy stripping Jeeps down to their bare frames. Windshields were removed to reduce weight, body panels discarded to improve speed, and extra fuel tanks welded into place to extend operational range. Vickers K machine guns, originally designed for aircraft, were mounted in twin configurations on reinforced frames, giving each vehicle devastating firepower. Some Jeeps carried additional Browning .50 caliber guns, or racks of grenades for hit-and-run strikes. They were fast, loud, and lethal, everything a conventional tank was not, and they were perfect for the kind of warfare the SAS specialized in. The first major operation using these modified Jeeps came in July 1943, when a detachment of SAS raiders penetrated more than 200 miles behind Axis lines to strike an airfield near Sidi Hainish. Moving under cover at night, they crossed open desert in columns of 15 vehicles, engines muffled and headlights covered. Just before dawn, they burst onto the airfield from 3 directions, guns blazing. Within minutes, fuel tanks were exploding, aircraft were burning, and German ground crews were scattering in panic. The raiders destroyed over 30 planes, set fire to massive fuel reserves, and vanished back into the desert before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The entire operation lasted less than half an hour, but its impact rippled across the front for weeks. Word of the raid, and others like it, spread quickly through Allied headquarters. Senior commander began to see the gun jeep not merely as a field improvisation, but as a strategic asset. They were more than vehicles. They were tools of operational art, capable of shaping the battlefield far beyond the range of conventional forces. Fuel depots that once seemed secure were now vulnerable. Convoys that had relied on speed for safety now required heavy escorts. Even airfields deep behind the lines could no longer be considered safe havens. The Axis was forced to divert troops, artillery, and aircraft to defend facilities that had previously needed little protection, a drain on resources that weakened their frontline strength. The success of the SAS raids also changed how Allied planners thought about mobility itself. The old model of warfare, with its emphasis on heavily armored thrusts and static front lines, was being challenged by a new paradigm in which speed and surprise could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the size of the force. The Jeep raids were not about holding territory or destroying enemy armies in pitched battles. They were about disruption, erosion, and psychological impact. They made the enemy feel hunted, even deep within their own territory. Maxwell, watching these developments from his post in Tunisia, understood that something fundamental was shifting. What had begun as a desperate solution to a tactical gap was now influencing strategy at the highest levels. Reports from the SAS were glowing, and American Ranger units in the Mediterranean were beginning to experiment with similar modifications. Even armored divisions, once skeptical of the idea, were exploring how gun jeep units could operate as screens ahead of advancing tank columns, softening resistance and confusing enemy command structures. The doctrine that emerged from these experiments was not written in any official manual. It was forged instead in the desert, in raids that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, in columns of stripped-down jeeps that roared across the dunes faster than artillery could track them. It was a doctrine built not on brute force, but on mobility as a weapon in itself. And in that shift lay a profound realization that in the mechanized age of war, victory would not belong solely to the side with the biggest guns or the thickest armor, but to the side that could move fastest, strike hardest, and disappear before the enemy even knew what had hit them. The Jeep's success in the deserts of North Africa was undeniable, but it was only half the story. Thousands of miles away, in a completely different kind of battlefield, the same concept was about to be reborn. The Pacific Theater offered none of the vast, open spaces that had made mobility such a deadly advantage in Tunisia and Libya. Here, the war was fought in suffocating jungles, along muddy riverbanks, and through villages swallowed by thick vegetation. Roads were little more than narrow tracks carved into the earth, often swallowed by monsoon rains or blocked by fallen trees. Movement was slow, visibility was limited, and ambushes lurked in every shadow. Yet the tactical problems were the same. Tanks were too heavy to maneuver through the terrain, armored cars were too rare, and infantry advancing on foot were perilously exposed. If the Jeep could evolve into a desert raider, perhaps it could also become something else, a jungle predator. American field engineers in New Guinea were among the first to experiment with adapting the gun Jeep concept to these new conditions. The modifications they made were born of necessity. In the jungle, overhead threats were constant. Snipers perched in palm trees, mortars arcing down from hidden positions, and fragments from booby traps set in the canopy. The open-top designs that had served well in the desert were a liability here. Engineers responded by welding sheets of light armor over the crew compartments, creating a low, protective canopy that shielded drivers and gunners without adding too much weight. Radiators, vulnerable to shrapnel and small arms fire, were encased in sloped metal housings to prevent catastrophic damage from frontal hits. The armament changed too. The twin Vickers guns used by British raiders were replaced with pintle-mounted .50 caliber Browning machine guns, whose heavy rounds could punch through dense undergrowth and even penetrate the thin walls of Japanese bunkers. Some Jeeps carried additional side-mounted .30 caliber guns to give them suppressive fire capability as they advanced with infantry columns. The result was less a raiding vehicle and more a mobile fire support platform, still fast and nimble, but built to fight in close quarters and survive the unpredictable violence of jungle warfare. Tactical doctrine shifted accordingly. In the Pacific, these modified Jeeps were rarely used for deep penetration raids. Instead, they moved with infantry, providing mobile firepower that could respond instantly to ambushes and suppress enemy positions before troops advanced. In the muddy trails around Buna and Salamala, gun jeeps often led the way for assault teams, their heavy guns chewing through undergrowth and pinning down Japanese defenders who would conceal themselves in bunkers or spider holes. When infantry encountered fortified positions, the jeeps could swing around to flank them, using their mobility to deliver sustained fire from unexpected angles. One of the most successful deployments came during the Battle of Leyte in late 1944. As U.S. forces pushed inland from the beaches, they encountered fierce Japanese resistance from dug-in positions along the road to Ormoc. The terrain was a nightmare, narrow trails hemmed in by jungle on either side, perfect for ambushes. Tanks bogged down almost immediately, and artillery support was limited by poor visibility. Jeep-mounted fire teams stepped into the gap, operating in pairs. They advanced alongside infantry, their guns sweeping the tree line and knocking out machine gun nests before they could pin down the advancing troops. When Japanese troops attempted to counterattack, the jeeps reversed course and repositioned within minutes, laying down suppressive fire that allowed American units to regroup. The ability to maneuver quickly and deliver concentrated bursts of fire proved decisive in breaking through the Japanese defenses. The vehicles themselves bore the scars of their new environment. Mud clogged their tires and coated their undercarriages. Jungle vines wrapped around suspension systems, and humidity corroded metal faster than mechanics could clean it. Yet despite these challenges, the modified jeeps performed far beyond expectations. Their small size allowed them to move through terrain that larger vehicles could not, and their speed made them ideal for rapid reaction when enemy positions shifted or counterattacks developed. Most importantly, they gave infantry commanders a flexible tool, something that could be deployed quickly, repositioned constantly, and trusted to deliver firepower precisely where it was needed. What emerged from the Pacific campaigns was a new understanding of what the Jeep could be. It was no longer just a raider or a scout vehicle. It had become a mobile weapon system adaptable to nearly any environment, from desert dunes to jungle trails, and capable of filling roles that traditional armor could not. It had also become a bridge between infantry and mechanized warfare, a way to bring the speed and firepower vehicles into places where tanks and half-tracks would never tread. And with each mile of muddy trail it conquered, the Jeep's transformation from humble utility vehicle to battlefield mainstay grew more complete. The lessons learned in the jungles of the Pacific would ripple outward, shaping military doctrine for decades to come and proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones you build from what you already have. By 1944, the Jeep conversions that had once been dismissed as a laughable experiment had become a common sight on battlefields from North Africa to the Pacific. Soldiers no longer looked at them as improvisations, but as essential tools, nimble, lethal, and unpredictable. They had earned a new nickname in the ranks, mosquito tanks. Like their insect namesakes, they were small, fast, and relentless, capable of striking with precision and vanishing before the enemy could swat them. Their reputation was built not in training manuals or staff reports, but in the heat of combat, where eyewitnesses recalled how these unlikely machines performed feats that heavier vehicles could never manage. Private Samuel Lacey of the 1st Infantry Division remembered one such encounter during the Tunisian campaign. His platoon was pinned down near Kasserine Pass by an Italian armored column. "We could hear the tanks before we saw them," he wrote in a letter home. "The ground shook with every shell they fired. We had no armor of our own to meet them, just rifles and a single anti-tank gun that jammed after the second shot." The situation seemed hopeless until a trio of gun jeeps crested a low ridge to the north, engines roaring and guns already blazing. They darted between dunes, closing the distance faster than the Italian gunners could adjust their sights. One jeep flanked the column and raked its lighter support vehicles with sustained machine gun fire, while another circled behind and peppered the tank's exposed engine grills. Within minutes, the column had lost its fuel trucks and half its infantry support, forcing the tanks to halt and withdraw. "They didn't destroy the tanks," Lacey recalled, "but they broke their spine. It was like watching wasps harass a bull." Similar scenes played out across Europe as the Allied advance gained momentum. Near Falaise in Normandy, gun jeep crews ambushed a convoy of German half-tracks, carrying reinforcements to the front. Sergeant Harold McAllister described how his unit, armed with modified jeeps, lay in wait along a hedgerow-lined road. We let the lead vehicle pass before we opened up, he recounted. The first burst shredded the driver's compartment of the second half-track. The rest of the column tried to scatter, but we were too fast. We circled around them, cutting off their retreat and hammering their flanks. The ambush lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the jeeps were gone, leaving behind a scene of twisted metal and smoking wreckage. What struck McAllister most was how easily they had achieved what would have required a company of infantry and artillery support just a year earlier. We didn't need to destroy everything, he said. We just needed to cause chaos, and that we did. In the Pacific, the jeeps proved their worth in even more dramatic fashion. During the Battle of Luzon, elements of the 37th Infantry Division used mosquito tanks to punch through a network of Japanese defensive positions that had resisted repeated assaults. The terrain was narrow and heavily fortified, with bunkers hidden beneath the jungle canopy and machine gun nests guarding every approach. Conventional tactics had failed repeatedly, and the infantry was taking heavy casualties. The solution was mobility. At dawn, a dozen jeep-mounted teams advanced in a staggered formation, firing continuously as they weaved to the narrow trails. Their heavy machine guns chewed through wooden bunkers, and their speed allowed them to bypass choke points before defenders could bring heavier weapons to bear. They moved so fast it was like watching a storm, one officer wrote. They weren't just shooting, they were shaping the battle, forcing the enemy to react instead of plan. The effect on morale was profound. Infantry units that once felt exposed and vulnerable in open terrain now advanced with confidence, knowing that mosquito tanks could appear on the flank or rear of any enemy formation. Artillery observers noted that German and Japanese units began altering their tactics to counter the jeeps, deploying more mines and constructing obstacles on roads and trails. Even so, the jeeps continued to find ways through, adapting just as quickly as the enemy. Their very presence changed how battles unfolded. They disrupted supply lines, harassed retreating units, and turned reconnaissance missions into full-fledged combat operations. In several campaigns, their rapid movement and sustained pressure even caused enemy forces to abandon positions they might otherwise have held for weeks. What started as a wild field experiment, a handful of modified vehicles thrown together in desperation, had evolved into a core component of Allied combined arms strategy. By late 1944, entire battalions were being equipped with gun jeeps, and specialized training programs were developed to teach crews how to exploit their speed and agility. They operated alongside tanks, infantry, and aircraft as part of coordinated assaults, filling the gap between heavy armor and foot soldiers with a kind of mechanized fluidity that no one had anticipated 2 years earlier. The mosquito tanks had proven their worth not by brute strength, but by their ability to strike where they were least expected and to turn mobility itself into a weapon. And in doing so, they helped redefine how modern armies thought about mechanized warfare. If the mosquito tank had a defining characteristic beyond its speed, it was its sheer variety. No two of the vehicles looked exactly alike, because no two were ever built the same way. Each unit, each workshop, and sometimes each individual crew approached the task of conversion differently. The result was a chaotic but ingenious menagerie of armored jeeps, each one tailored to its environment, its mission, and the materials that happened to be on hand. What began as a crude field experiment had evolved into a kind of grassroots arms industry, one fueled not by assembly lines or blueprints, but by improvisation and necessity. Frontline mechanics became the unsung heroes of this evolution. Lacking the resources of proper vehicle factories, they turned scrapyards and battlefields into their supply depots. Abandoned tanks and wrecked trucks were stripped for armor plating, which was then cut down with torches and hammered into shape. Sections of boilerplate from damaged half-tracks found new life as side panels. Bent aircraft fuselage panels, scavenged from downed bombers, were repurposed into makeshift gun shields. In one particularly inventive case, engineers in Italy used segments of disused railroad tracks, cut and welded together, to form a crude but remarkably resilient frontal armor. The results were often ugly, plates bolted on at odd angles, welding seams running like scars across the body, but they worked. The weapon configurations were just as diverse. Some crews favored the tried-and-true .30 caliber Brownings, while others opted for the heavier punch of .50 caliber machine guns, mounting them in pairs or even triplets on reinforced roll bars. Ambitious units went further still. In France, one Ranger team mounted a pair of bazookas on swiveling brackets, giving their Jeep a kind of mobile anti-tank capability. In the Philippines, engineers rigged a small mortar to the rear bed of a Jeep, allowing crews to deliver indirect fire while remaining mobile. A few of the boldest experiments involved mounting short-barreled 37mm cannons, weapons originally intended for light tanks, directly onto reinforced frames. The recoil was punishing and often caused mechanical failures, but when they worked, these modified Jeeps could deliver devastating firepower against lightly armored vehicles and fortifications. The diversity wasn't just a matter of creativity. It reflected the adaptability of the concept itself. Each battlefield presented its own challenges, and each demanded different solutions. In the open expanses of the North African desert, where long-range engagements were common, crews emphasized speed, range, and heavy machine guns capable of sustained fire. In the tight confines of the Italian countryside, where ambushes were frequent and close-quarters fighting was the norm, armor plating and short-range weapons like bazookas and mortars became more common. In the Pacific, where dense jungle limited visibility and mobility, Jeeps were often outfitted with overhead protection and weapons designed for suppressive fire rather than long-range duels. The process of modification was rarely formalized. Most conversions took place in makeshift workshops, old barns, bombed-out garages, or open-air repair yards cobbled together near the front lines. Crews worked with whatever tools they had, often relying on hand-cranked welding equipment and improvised jigs. It was not uncommon for mechanics to barter with nearby units for spare parts or to scavenge abandoned vehicles under the cover of darkness. Some units even developed unofficial armor networks, sharing blueprints and sketches for particularly successful modifications through courier routes and field mail. These creative efforts produced vehicles that were as much a reflection of their crews' personalities as of their missions. Some Jeeps bore carefully painted camouflage patterns and welded armor skirts that looked almost professional. Others were patched together from so many different sources that they resembled moving scrap heaps. Yet even the most ragged of them could prove deadly in the right circumstances. In Normandy, a Jeep equipped with dual .50 caliber guns and a salvaged 20mm aircraft cannon ambushed a column of German transport vehicles, crippling half the convoy before disappearing into a hedgerow. In Burma, a Jeep modified with makeshift side armor and a pintle-mounted mortar provided covering fire for advancing infantry, lobbing shells into enemy trenches while weaving through the jungle at full speed. There was a deeper lesson in all this improvisation, one that did not escape the attention of Allied planners. It showed that innovation did not have come from design bureaus or centralized commands. Often, it was the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers and mechanics that pushed technology forward in ways doctrine had not yet imagined. The battlefield demanded constant adaptation, and the men who fought on it rose to the challenge with creativity that defied expectations. The gun Jeep was proof of that. It was not a polished product of industry, but a living, evolving weapon, shaped and reshaped by the hands of those who used it. By the final year of the war, these field engineer machines had become more than just tools. They were symbols of Allied flexibility and determination. Each welded plate and improvised mount told a story of resourcefulness under pressure. Each unlikely configuration was a testament to the fact that victory in modern war belonged not just to those who could build the most powerful weapons, but to those who could adapt the fastest. And in that sense, the mini-tanks were not just weapons of war. They were embodiments of the creativity and resilience that defined the Allied fight itself. At first, the Axis High Command paid little attention to the strange new vehicles appearing on the battlefield. Reports from the front described them in dismissive terms: light trucks with machine guns, toy wagons used by undisciplined raiders, or cowboy tactics by Allied irregulars. In Berlin, intelligence officers cataloged them as minor threats, nuisances that might harass a supply line, but posed no real danger to Wehrmacht's heavy formations. In Tokyo, they were seen as evidence of Allied desperation, a sign that American and British forces were stretched thin and resorting to improvisation. It was a mistake that would cost them dearly. By mid-1943, those early dismissals were impossible to sustain. The number of attacks on Axis supply lines was growing exponentially, and the scale of damage was staggering. Reports arrived daily from the Africa Corps describing convoys ambushed and destroyed by fast-moving jeeps that struck from nowhere and vanished before reinforcements could respond. A single raiding force of 12 jeeps could cripple an entire logistics column in under an hour, burning fuel trucks, disabling communication vehicles, and forcing survivors to abandon their cargo. Italian units stationed in Libya reported losing entire weeks' worth of supplies to what they derisively called dust devils, swarms of vehicles that appeared suddenly from the dunes, kicked up chaos, and melted back into the desert. In one infamous incident near El Agheila, a convoy of over 30 German trucks carrying ammunition and fuel was attacked by fewer than 10 jeeps armed with heavy machine guns and bazookas. The raid lasted only 20 minutes, but by the time it ended, nearly every truck had been destroyed or abandoned, and the survivors were scattered across the desert. A furious message from the local commander to Berlin described the attackers as ghosts who refuse battle and leave nothing but fire and ruin. It was one of many such reports, and they began to change the way the Axis viewed the threat. The first countermeasures focused on convoy security. German and Italian commanders began reinforcing supply columns with additional infantry and light armored vehicles. Machine gun nests were established along key routes, and reconnaissance patrols were increased to detect jeep raids before they could strike. But these measures came at a steep cost. Every truck that needed an escort was a truck not delivering ammunition to the front. Every soldier diverted to guard duty was one less fighting in the line. The logistical burden grew heavier, and still the raids continued. The jeep's speed and unpredictability meant they could choose the time and place of engagement, often bypassing heavily defended routes in favor of secondary roads and isolated convoys. The Luftwaffe was brought into the fight as well. Low-flying reconnaissance planes were tasked with spotting raiding parties, and fighter patrols were assigned to hunt them down. But even air power struggled to counter a weapon that rarely stayed in one place for long. Pilots complained that the jeeps were too small and too well camouflaged to detect until it was too late. By the time patrol arrived over a reported raid site, the attackers were often miles away, hidden in wadis or abandoned villages. One Luftwaffe report, filed after repeated failures to stop the raids, described the vehicles as faster than our response and more cunning than our defenses. In Europe, the problem grew worse as the Allies pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy. German commanders accustomed to static defenses and predictable front lines were suddenly forced to contend with Allied raiding parties that struck deep behind their positions. Fuel dumps exploded overnight, telephone lines were cut, and bridgeheads were seized by jeep-mounted teams long before conventional units could arrive. To counter the threat, the Wehrmacht began deploying heavier escorts with convoys, half-tracks, armor cars, and even light tanks. They laid mines along roads and built fortified checkpoints at key intersections. But every new defensive measure slowed the logistics network further, and every delay rippled through their overstretched supply chain. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders faced similar challenges. Initially confident that their dense jungle defenses would protect their supply lines, they were shocked when jeep-mounted raiders began appearing on narrow trails and striking isolated depots. Japanese patrols reported that the vehicles were impossible to catch, capable of slipping through gaps in the terrain and escaping through paths that seemed impassable. The Imperial Army responded by building more roadblocks, increasing night patrols, and laying ambushes. But like their German counterparts, they found that each new measure only spread their resources thinner. The psychological effect of the jeep raids was just as damaging as their physical impact. Convoy drivers dreaded the open road, knowing that a column that left camp intact in the morning might be nothing but wreckage by nightfall. Field commanders grew cautious, slowing their movements and rerouting supplies along longer, less efficient paths. Even heavily defended convoys traveled in fear, their machine gunners scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might signal an approaching swarm. What the Axis had once dismissed as a nuisance had become a constant, grinding pressure, one that forced them to change tactics, reallocate resources, and fight a war on terms they had not chosen. By late 1944, the weaponized jeep was no longer just a tool of opportunity. It was a strategic problem, one that the Axis never fully solved. Every convoy that needed protection, every road that had to be fortified, and every patrol sent out to guard against raiders represented energy diverted from the front. And in a war where logistics were as decisive as battles, that diversion helped tip the balance toward the Allies. What began as a small, improvisational threat had grown into a force that bent enemy strategy to its will, proving that even most powerful armies could be undone by a weapon they once refused to take seriously. By the time 1944 arrived, what had begun as a scrappy field improvisation in the deserts of North Africa had transformed into a global phenomenon. The gun jeep, once dismissed as a desperate attempt to make a utility vehicle more useful, was now a vital part of Allied operations across 3 continents. The design, if it could even be called that, no longer belonged to any single army or unit. It had been adopted, adapted, and reinvented by nearly every major Allied force, each tailoring it to their unique environments, tactics, and strategic goals. What united them all was the understanding that mobility, flexibility, and shock could be just as powerful as heavy armor and brute firepower, and often far more decisive. British Special Air Service units continued to refine the concept they had pioneered in the desert. Their jeeps became faster, leaner, and deadlier, stripped of anything unnecessary and loaded with as many weapons as their frames could carry. Twin Vickers K guns mounted on rotating platforms gave them devastating firepower against soft targets, while racks of grenades and incendiary devices allowed them to wreak havoc on fuel depots and ammunition dumps. These mobile raiding units struck hundreds of miles behind Axis lines, often operating without supply support for days at a time. They became legends among the troops and nightmares for German commanders. Rommel himself reportedly complained that the SAS jeeps were like water, impossible to hold and impossible to destroy. The Americans, meanwhile, took the concept and expanded it in their own way. Ranger battalions used gun jeeps for rapid insertions and flanking maneuvers, often pairing them with airborne units to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce tenuous footholds. Their jeeps were fitted with heavier weapons, .50 caliber Brownings, and even recoilless rifles, turning them into mobile fire support platforms that could be deployed far faster than traditional artillery. In Italy and later in France, Ranger units used them to spearhead assaults on key crossroads and choke points, seizing critical ground before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The speed of these attacks and the confusion they sowed often caused German commanders to overestimate the size of the forces they were facing, diverting troops and artillery to counter what was, in reality, a handful of highly mobile teams. On the other side of the world, Australian commandos were putting their own stamp on the concept in the jungles of New Guinea and Borneo. Their modifications emphasized durability and stealth, with reinforced suspensions to handle rough terrain and quieter engines designed for deep penetration reconnaissance. These jeeps were often painted in camouflage patterns that blended with the dense foliage, allowing them to creep close to Japanese positions before unleashing devastating bursts of fire. In one operation on Bougainville, a small group of Australian jeeps ambushed a Japanese motor column, destroying over a dozen vehicles in under 10 minutes and disappearing into the jungle before the enemy could respond. Such raids, repeated again and again, shattered Japanese confidence in their interior lines of communication and forced them to divert troops to guard against threats that seemed to come from nowhere. The Free French, too, embraced a philosophy of mobility that the gun jeeps represented. Operating alongside British and American forces, they used them for reconnaissance, sabotage, and hit-and-run engagements during the liberation of France. French resistance fighters, many of whom had little formal military training, quickly learned how to drive and operate the vehicles, turning them into highly effective guerrilla tools. In the chaotic months following D-Day, French-operated jeeps played a crucial role in cutting German retreat routes, harassing isolated garrisons, and guiding advancing Allied armor through unfamiliar territory. This proliferation of designs and tactics was not the result of top-down orders or centralized planning. It was driven by necessity, by the urgent realities of a global war that stretched supply lines thin and demanded creative solutions to constantly evolving challenges. Armored divisions could not be everywhere, nor could air support or artillery, but jeeps could be built quickly, modified in the field, and deployed in large numbers without straining logistics. They filled a gap that no other weapon could, bridging the divide between infantry and armor, speed and firepower, offense and reconnaissance. By the end of 1944, the gun jeep was no longer just a stopgap solution, it was doctrine. Field manuals began incorporating tactics specifically for their use. Training programs were created to teach crews how to exploit their mobility, coordinate with infantry and armor, and conduct raids deep behind enemy lines. They were integrated into combined arms operations, working alongside tanks, artillery, and aircraft to achieve objectives that none could accomplish alone. And perhaps most importantly, they changed how commanders thought about warfare itself. Speed was no longer just a logistical advantage. It was a weapon in its own right. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific, the gun jeep embodied a new philosophy of war. It was not the biggest or the most powerful weapon on a battlefield, but it was often the one that arrived first, struck hardest, and left the deepest impression. Born of necessity and forged in improvisation, it had become one of the most versatile and feared tools of the Allied arsenal. Proof that innovation does not always begin in factories or laboratories. Sometimes it begins in the dust and chaos of the front line, with nothing more than a wrench, a welding torch, and an idea. The hedgerow country of Normandy in the summer of 1944 was a landscape designed to frustrate armies. Narrow lanes hemmed in by high earthen walls, thick with ancient hedges and trees, turned every movement into an ambush waiting to happen. Tanks lumbered awkwardly through the maze-like roads, their turrets unable to swivel fully, their visibility limited to a few dozen meters. Infantry slogged forward cautiously, aware that a single machine gun hidden behind a hedgerow could halt an entire company. It was in this difficult terrain, during the chaotic breakout from the beachheads, that the weaponized jeep once again proved its worth, not as a secondary support vehicle, but as a decisive tool of disruption and terror. Allied planners knew that the key to breaking out of Normandy was speed. Once the German lines were pierced, reinforcements would pour in to seal the breach, and the window of opportunity would close. Conventional armored units were too slow to exploit that gap quickly enough. The jeeps, on the other hand, were fast, agile, and capable of operating independently far behind enemy lines. As soon as the front shifted in late July, small teams of gun jeeps surged forward like a flood bursting through a dam. They slipped through gaps in German defenses, using farm lanes, dirt roads, and even abandoned railway beds to bypass heavily defended routes. Their mission was not to fight pitched battles, but to sow chaos. They cut telephone and telegraph lines, severing communication between frontline units and their headquarters. They raided supply depots and fuel dumps, often setting fire to them before disappearing into countryside. Convoys carrying reinforcements or ammunition were ambushed on lonely roads, their vehicles shredded by machine gun fire before the crews even realized they were under attack. Bridges were seized hours before German engineers could demolish them, allowing Allied armor columns to surge forward without delay. In some cases, the jeeps even faked larger assaults, circling enemy positions at night, firing sporadically from multiple directions, and forcing German units to divert troops to defend against phantom forces. The effect was devastating. A German logistics officer later described the experience as being bitten death by hornets. Units that had been marching confidently toward the front found themselves harried at every turn. A column of trucks might make it through one ambush only to be struck again 5 miles down the road. Ammunition dumps that had been carefully stockpiled were found burning by morning. Bridges that were supposed to be defended at all costs were captured intact because their garrisons had been drawn away by false reports of larger Allied forces nearby. It was war not as a steady line of advance, but as a series of sudden, disorienting shocks, and the Germans were never able to fully adapt to it. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers began referring to the gun jeeps as Teufelsinsekten, devil's insects, for the way they appeared suddenly, stung hard, and vanished into the night. Convoy drivers refused to travel without armored escorts. Communications personnel demanded heavier defenses for their relay stations. Even seasoned Wehrmacht officers admitted that they had never faced anything like the constant harassment of the Allied raiders. One officer wrote in his diary that no road is safe, no bridge secure, no message certain. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere, Eyewitness accounts from the Allied side reveal just how daring and improvisational these operations were. Lieutenant James Carter, the 5th Armored Division, recalled an overnight raid in which his Jeep patrol seized a key bridge over the Sea River. "We moved at dusk, no headlights, just moonlight and luck," he wrote. "We reached the bridge before dawn, surprised the guards, and held it for 6 hours before the tanks arrived. The Germans shelled us twice, but we kept moving, never staying in one spot long enough for their artillery to catch us. That single action allowed an entire armor brigade to push forward unopposed, collapsing a section of the German line that might otherwise have held for days." The raids also demonstrated how far the Jeep concept had evolved from its improvised beginnings. These were not haphazard attacks by under-equipped units, but carefully coordinated operations involving intelligence, logistics, and timing. Resistance fighters often provided critical information about enemy positions and road conditions, while Allied aircraft scouted for potential targets from above. Fuel and ammunition caches were prepositioned along likely routes to allow the Jeeps to operate deep behind enemy lines. Every raid was a blend of planning and audacity, and the results spoke for themselves. By the time Operation Cobra, the code name for the breakout from Normandy, reached its climax, gun Jeeps were playing a role far larger than anyone had imagined just a year earlier. They were no longer supporting the main offensive. They were shaping it. Their raids fragmented German command and control, slowed reinforcements, and opened pathways that conventional forces could exploit. And perhaps most importantly, they shattered the illusion of German security in the rear areas. In the battle for France, it was not always the heaviest tank or the largest gun that turned the tide. Sometimes it was a small, fast, improvised machine, part truck, part weapon, that roared down a dark country road and changed the course of a campaign. In the wake of the Normandy breakout, the Allied advance across France turned into a logistical nightmare. Armies that had once crawled forward now raced eastward, consuming fuel, ammunition, and rations at a staggering rate. Entire divisions depended on a continuous flow of supplies to keep moving, and that flow had to cross hundreds of miles of newly liberated but still dangerous territory. Bridges were barely repaired, roads were clogged with retreating German units, and the threat of ambush by isolated enemy detachments or sabotage teams loomed over every mile of open highway. It was in this precarious moment that the Red Ball Express, a massive round-the-clock trucking operation, became the lifeline of the Allied campaign. And at the heart of that lifeline, once again, were the weaponized Jeeps. The Red Ball Express was an audacious solution to a nearly impossible problem. Launched in August 1944, it involved more than 6,000 trucks running nonstop from the beaches of Normandy to forward depots near the advancing front. These convoys carried everything from gasoline and artillery shells to field rations and spare tank treads. Without them, the Allied armies would have ground to a halt within weeks. But the operation scale also made a target. German stragglers, Waffen-SS raiding parties, and armed resistance groups loyal to the Reich prowled the countryside, desperate to disrupt the supply lines that were strangling their defensive efforts. Bridges were mined, roads were ambushed, and lone convoys were sometimes wiped out before they reached their destinations. The need for security was immediate, and the Jeep, with its speed and firepower, proved the perfect answer. Armed Jeeps became the eyes and teeth of the Red Ball Express. Positioned at the front, rear, and flanks of convoys, they performed multiple roles simultaneously. Scouts at the head of the column raced ahead to check for roadblocks, mines, or ambush sites, reporting back quickly so the convoy could reroute or prepare for a fight. Others patrolled the flanks, watching for signs of enemy movement or suspicious activity. At the rear, roving Jeep teams acted as a rapid response force, ready to counterattack if German raiders struck from behind. Their presence transformed the convoys from vulnerable targets into moving fortresses. The firepower they brought to bear was considerable. Many of these escort Jeeps were armed with pintle-mounted .50 caliber machine guns capable of shredding light vehicles and infantry formations alike. Some carried additional side-mounted weapons or grenade launchers to break up ambushes. Others were equipped with radios to call on artillery or air support if they encountered heavier opposition. The effect was immediate. German raiding parties that had once attacked convoys with relative impunity now found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Survivors reported that the Jeep's speed and aggression made them impossible to pin down. They would appear from the tree line, unleash a hail of gunfire, and vanish down the road before a counterattack could be mounted. The psychological effect on Allied drivers was just as significant. Convoy duty had once been one of the most dangerous assignments in the Army, a tense journey where every curve might conceal an ambush. But with armed Jeeps escorting them, drivers reported a newfound sense of confidence. "You always felt better when you saw those Jeeps," one Red Ball veteran recalled. "You knew if something happened, they'd be the first to fight back, and they'd fight hard." That morale boost translated into speed. Convoys moved faster and with fewer delays, pushing supplies deeper into occupied territory and keeping pace with the relentless Allied advance. The Jeeps also proved invaluable in situations where mobility was essential. Bridges that had been sabotaged or blown up required detours through back roads and small villages, where the risk of ambush was high. Heavier armored vehicles could not easily navigate these narrow routes, but Jeeps could. They darted ahead, cleared the way, and provided cover as trucks lumbered through choke points. On several occasions, Jeep escorts even chased down and captured German saboteurs attempting to plant charges on bridges or rail lines. Their speed and ability to respond instantly made them indispensable in a logistical operation that demanded constant movement and adaptation. The Red Ball Express itself became a symbol of Allied momentum, a relentless flow of steel and fuel that kept the Army supplied as they surged toward the German border. And while its success depended on thousands of drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers, it also owed much to small, fast, deadly machines that guarded it mile after mile. Without the gun Jeeps, many convoys would never have reached their destinations. Supply disruptions would have slowed offensives, delayed breakthroughs, and possibly extended the war. Instead, the Jeeps helped ensure that the Allies' logistical arteries remained open, no matter how desperate the German attempts to sever them. By the time Allied forces reached the Rhine, the weaponized Jeep had cemented its reputation as more than a battlefield raider. It had become a guardian of the supply lines, a bridge between the front and the rear, and a vital piece of the logistical machinery that made modern war possible. In a campaign defined by speed and relentless forward motion, the Jeep's role was both humble and heroic, a small, rugged vehicle that turned vulnerable convoys into unstoppable lifelines and carried the weight of victory on its wheels. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, armies on both sides of the conflict were left to sift through the lessons of 6 years of unprecedented industrial warfare. Historians, engineers, and tacticians pored over battle reports, production figures, and field diaries, searching for the innovations that had made victory possible. Among the many technologies that defined the war, radar, jet propulsion, atomic weapons. One of the most deceptively influential came not from a laboratory or a research program, but from a dusty motor pool and a field experiment that had once seemed almost ridiculous. The weaponized Jeep, born of necessity and improvisation, had left an imprint far beyond its size. In the post-war era, its legacy would ripple outward, shaping the future of military vehicle design and doctrine for decades to come. The first and most immediate descendants of the mini-tank were light reconnaissance vehicles, many of which were developed before the war was even over. Allied commanders had learned that speed and mobility could be more decisive than raw firepower in certain scenarios, and post-war planners sought to institutionalize that lesson. Vehicles like the British Ferret Scout car and the American M38, introduced in the early 1950s, carried the DNA of the weaponized Jeep. They were light, fast, and versatile, designed to operate ahead of armored formations, scout enemy positions, and deliver quick, concentrated bursts of fire. Many incorporated features that had first appeared as improvisations. Pinto mounts for heavy machine guns, modular armor plates, and space for radio and reconnaissance equipment. The Jeep's influence also extended into airborne warfare. The lessons of rapid deployment and mobility learned from Mosquito tank. Operations directly informed the development of light assault vehicles that could be airdropped or carried by gliders into enemy territory. These new platforms, designed for paratrooper units and airborne commandos, combined speed with enough firepower to seize and hold critical objectives until heavier forces could arrive. They were built small and light enough to be transported in the cargo bays of aircraft, but rugged enough to survive the harsh conditions of forward operations. The The logic behind them was the same that had guided the Jeep's transformation during the war. In modern combat, the ability to strike fast, adapt quickly, and move freely could often achieve more than sheer weight of armor. Perhaps the most striking evolution of the Jeep's legacy came during the Cold War, when new conflicts demanded new solutions to old problems. As U.S. forces found themselves fighting unconventional wars in places like Korea and later Vietnam, the lessons of World War II's improvisations were rediscovered. The concept of the mobile, lightly armored fire support platform reemerged in the form of the gun truck, cargo vehicles retrofitted with steel plating and heavy weapons to protect convoys from ambush. These vehicles, widely used during the Vietnam War, were direct descendants of the Jeep escorts that had guarded the Red Ball Express. They operated under the same principle. Speed and adaptability were force multipliers, especially when facing enemies who favored hit-and-run tactics over set-piece battles. The influence of the weaponized Jeep was not limited to Western militaries. Soviet designers, too, studied Allied experiments with light, fast vehicles, and drew their own conclusions. The BRDM series of reconnaissance vehicles, first introduced in the 1950s, embodied many of the same characteristics: small size, high speed, versatility, and the ability to deliver significant firepower relative to their weight. Even nations rebuilding their militaries from scratch after the war looked to the Jeep as a model. It was cheap, easy to produce, and adaptable to a wide range of roles, from scouting and escort duties to direct combat support. Doctrinally, the Jeep's legacy was just as profound. It helped shift military thinking away from the rigid belief that firepower had to be tied to heavy armor. Strategists began to understand that mobility itself was a form of protection, that a vehicle which could move quickly and unpredictably was often harder to kill than one wrapped in inches of steel. This thinking informed not just vehicle design, but entire tactical doctrines. Concepts like deep reconnaissance, rapid reaction forces, and air-mobile strike groups all trace their lineage to the lessons first learned by soldiers who bolted guns onto Jeeps and took them into battle. Even in the civilian sector, the Jeep's wartime transformation left its mark. The post-war boom in utility vehicles, from rugged off-road trucks to civilian versions of military Jeeps, was fueled by the public's fascination with the vehicle's versatility and durability. Many of the features now taken for granted in off-road and tactical vehicles, modular design, removable weapon mounts, reinforced suspensions, can be traced back to field innovations made during World War II. By the 1960s and 1970s, the concept that had once been sketched on a ration box had become standard military practice. Armies around the world fielded fleets of light, mobile, multi-role vehicles designed to exploit speed and flexibility. Specialized reconnaissance units, rapid deployment brigades, and mechanized cavalry formations all bore the conceptual fingerprints of the original gun Jeeps. The weapon-borne necessity had grown into a philosophy, one that continued to shape how nations prepared for and fought wars long after the original Jeeps had rusted into history. And in that philosophy was a lasting truth. In an age where wars could be decided as much by movement as by firepower, even the smallest machine could leave an outsized mark on the future of warfare. In the decades that followed the war, historians and military analysts often focus on the grand narratives, the sweeping offensives, the technological breakthroughs, the strategic decisions made in distant command rooms. Yet when engineers, mechanics, and veterans who had actually built and fought with the weaponized Jeeps were interviewed, they told a different story. Their memories were not about grand strategy or high theory. They were about dirt floors, oil-stained hands, and nights spent welding under flickering lantern light. They spoke not of planned revolutions, but of improvised solutions born out of necessity. To them, the lesson of the mini tanks was clear. Innovation in war rarely starts in laboratories. It begins in motor pools, field workshops, and desperate moments, driven not by doctrine but by soldiers who refuse to accept the limitations of their tools. One such soldier was Sergeant Thomas Mack McAllister, a mechanic attached to the 1st Armored Division in North Africa. Interviewed in the 1970s, McAllister recalled the day his unit first experimented with welding a salvaged aircraft machine gun onto a Jeep. "We didn't have the parts we needed, and we didn't have the vehicles we wanted," he said. "What we had was a pile of scrap, a couple of torches, and a problem that needed solving. That problem, How to give lightly armed patrols a fighting chance against German reconnaissance units was never going to be solved by waiting for orders from headquarters or shipments from Detroit. We had to build something with what we had, he explained. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. That willingness to improvise, to act without waiting for permission, was what transformed the Jeep from a supply-run vehicle into a weapon of war. The same spirit was alive in workshops thousands of miles away. In Italy, Lieutenant Arthur Renard's team used abandoned German armor plates to reinforce the sides of their Jeeps, welding them on by hand with equipment that was never meant for battlefield use. It was rough work, Renard remembered. Half the time the welds looked like bird droppings. But we learned fast. Every time a Jeep came back with holes in it, we made changes. Every time one broke down, we figured out why. It was constant trial and error. That cycle of adaptation was emblematic of how real battlefield innovation unfolds. There is no blueprint, no perfect solution, only continuous refinement born of immediate necessity. For the soldiers who fought in them, the improvised Jeeps became symbols of resourcefulness. Corporal Raymond Ellis, a gunner who rode shotgun on a modified Jeep during the Normandy breakout, described how much faith he placed in a machine that, by all accounts, should not have existed. It rattled like a tin can and felt like it would fall apart if you sneezed too hard, he recalled with a laugh. But it saved our lives. We were faster, meaner, and more unpredictable than anything the Germans threw at us. Ellis's words echoed a sentiment shared by many veterans. The imperfections of the Jeeps were part of their strength. They were not delicate machines engineered in pristine factories. They were battlefield inventions, imperfect, improvised, and built for the brutal realities of combat. This grassroots approach to innovation was not lost on post-war military planners. Decades later, many of the engineers who built the first weaponized Jeeps were invited to consult on new vehicle programs. They often clashed with younger designers who prioritized theoretical performance over practical field utility. We'd tell them, "Don't overthink it," said former field engineer Walter Hayes in an interview conducted in 1982. "A soldier in the field will find a way to make your design work, or he'll change it to suit his needs. The real trick is to give him something he can adapt." Hayes' perspective highlighted a fundamental shift in military thinking. The war had shown that even the best designed weapons had to evolve once they reached the battlefield. Flexibility and adaptability mattered as much as firepower and armor. The lesson extended beyond vehicles. Across all branches of the military, the war had proven that improvisation was not a sign of weakness, but a critical strength. Units that adapted quickly, that learned to repurpose tools and think creatively under pressure, often outperformed those with superior equipment but rigid doctrine. It was a truth that had been written in the sand of North Africa, the mud of Italy, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the jungles of the Pacific, and it continued to shape military thinking long after the war ended. Perhaps the most profound insight shared by those veterans and engineers was the humility with which they viewed their achievements. Few saw themselves as innovators or pioneers. They were mechanics who refused to accept defeat, soldiers who needed a fighting chance, and leaders who believed that every problem had a solution if you were willing to build it yourself. Their creations may have looked crude, but they embodied a deeper truth, that the ingenuity of ordinary people, armed with nothing more than determination and a welding torch, can change the course of a war. And in that sense, the story of the weaponized Jeep is not just about a machine. It is about a mindset, one that turned scarcity into opportunity and necessity into invention. When Lieutenant Colonel Robert Red Maxwell first sketched the outline of an armored Jeep on the back of a ration box in the Tunisian sun, he could never have imagined the legacy it would leave behind. What began as a desperate improvisation, an attempt to bridge the yawning gap between infantry and heavy armor, became something far greater. It was not just a clever battlefield solution or a temporary fix. It was the birth of a new philosophy in warfare, the idea that speed, adaptability, and ingenuity could rival, and in many cases outperform. Brute force reshaped the way armies thought about mobility. Decades after the last gun Jeep rolled off the battlefield, its spirit continues to roll forward, embedded in the design and doctrine of modern militaries around the world. The immediate aftermath of the war made the significance of Maxwell's experiment clear. Militaries, having witnessed a Jeep's transformative effect on operations, began to reimagine the role of light vehicles. The old assumption that firepower and protection had come from tons of steel and towering turrets was replaced by a more nuanced understanding of combat. Speed itself was a kind of armor. Agility could be a weapon. Flexibility could compensate for mass. These principles were codified into post-war doctrine, influencing everything from reconnaissance tactics to the way mechanized infantry units were structured. Light vehicles were no longer relegated to logistical support or communications. They became integral to the fight. As technology advanced, the DNA of Maxwell's Mosquito tanks was woven into a new generation of combat vehicles. During the Cold War, the rise of mechanized rapid reaction forces saw the development of specialized platforms that embodied the same philosophy: small, fast, modular, and deadly. Armored scout cars, light assault vehicles, and airborne deployable transports all trace their lineage to the wartime Jeep. They carried heavier weapons, better armor, and more advanced communications, but their purpose remained unchanged: to strike where the enemy least expected, to exploit speed and maneuver, and to adapt quickly to evolving threats. The influence extended into the most elite units. Special forces organizations like the British SAS, U.S. Army Rangers, and later the Navy SEALs built their mobility doctrines around vehicles that echoed Maxwell's original design principles. The Land Rover-based Pink Panthers of the SAS in the 1950s and 1960s were spiritual successors to the North African raiding Jeeps. Stripped down, heavily armed, and designed for deep penetration missions behind enemy lines. American Special Forces vehicles during the Vietnam War followed the same lineage, prioritizing mobility and modularity over heavy protection. Even in the harsh deserts of Afghanistan and Iraq decades later, U.S. and British Special Operations forces relied on lightweight, open-frame vehicles capable of rapid strikes across difficult terrain. Perhaps the clearest modern heirs to the gun Jeep's legacy are the MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, and light tactical vehicles of the 21st century. Although they are larger, more sophisticated, and built to withstand the dangers of modern battlefields, their purpose remains rooted in the same philosophy: to provide troops with adaptable platforms that balance speed, firepower, and survivability. MRAPs, designed to protect against roadside bombs while retaining mobility, and vehicles like the U.S. Special Operations Command's Ground Mobility Vehicle, equipped for long-range raids. Both owe their conceptual foundations to the lessons first learned by Maxwell's mechanics in a dusty North African workshop. The impact of the Jeep experiment goes beyond the hardware. It also transformed the mindset of military innovation. The success of the weaponized Jeep demonstrated that some of the most significant advances in warfare come not from top-down directives or billion-dollar research programs, but from bottom-up ingenuity. It showed that soldiers in the field, faced with immediate challenges and limited resources, could create solutions that changed the course of military thinking. That lesson still informs how armies approach technological development today, with modular designs, field-upgradable systems, and user-driven innovation becoming standard practice. Even outside the military, the cultural imprint of Maxwell's idea remains visible. The civilian off-road and utility vehicle industries owe much of their existence to the Jeep's wartime evolution. The rugged, all-terrain vehicles that populate farms, construction sites, and adventure trails around the world are direct descendants of the machine that once roared through the hedgerows of Normandy and the deserts of Libya. In a broader sense, the very concept of versatility, of a vehicle that can be modified and repurposed for countless roles, is part of the legacy that began with a few scraps of metal, a welding torch, and a refusal to accept limitations. Today, when modern soldiers deploy into remote regions in lightweight strike vehicles, when special forces use speed and mobility to outmaneuver stronger foes, or when armored convoys rely on rapid response escorts to secure vital supply lines, they are continuing the tradition that started with Maxwell's crazy idea. The vehicles they ride may be far more advanced, their weapons more lethal, their communications more sophisticated, but the principles remain the same. The story of the gun Jeep is not frozen in the pages of history. It is written into the very fabric of modern warfare. The legacy of that field experiment is a reminder that innovation often begins not with grand designs, but with simple questions. What do we have? What can we make of it? And how can it change the fight? In answering those questions, Maxwell and his men left behind something far greater than a modified vehicle. They left a blueprint, one that continues to guide the evolution of military power on four wheels.